Stay with me, because what you're about to see isn't just political theater. This is the moment a superpower looked at its closest ally and said, "We don't need you." And the math behind what happens next is absolutely terrifying. President Trump didn't whisper this. He didn't hedge. He stated it as fact. Canada relies entirely on the U.S. We don't rely on Canada. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, deliberately, with absolute certainty. And here's the part that should make every American paying attention right now deeply, deeply concerned. That statement might be the single most economically illiterate claim ever made by a sitting president on the world stage. I'm not exaggerating. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand exactly why, and you'll see the numbers that prove it. Because right now, as you're watching this, 4.1 million barrels of Canadian oil are crossing into the United States every single day. That's not some days, not when it's convenient, every single day. Canada supplies 63% of all U.S. crude oil imports. Nearly 2/3 of every barrel of foreign oil entering American refineries comes from one country. But here's where this gets interesting. American refineries along the Gulf Coast weren't built to run on just any oil. They're specifically designed for heavy crude, the dense, sulfur-rich oil that flows from Alberta's oil sands. This isn't preference. This is billions of dollars in infrastructure designed for exactly this type of crude over decades. So when Trump says America doesn't need Canada, he's claiming the U.S. can replace 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude overnight. From where? From Venezuela, production collapsed, Mexico, declining year over year, the Middle East. Sure, technically possible, but you're talking about completely rebuilding supply chains, reconfiguring refinery operations, and relying on a region where stability is measured in weeks, not centuries. But it's not just oil. Canada supplies 98% of U.S. natural gas imports. When homes in the Midwest heat their houses in winter, when power plants in the Northeast keep the lights on, that energy is flowing from Canadian pipelines. And electricity? Canada provides 82% of all electricity imported by the United States. States like New York, Michigan, Minnesota aren't buying Canadian power as a supplement. They're depending on it to meet peak demand, to prevent blackouts when consumption spikes. Let me put this in perspective for you. The entire energy relationship was valued at $151 billion in 2024. That's not Canada exploiting America. That's American businesses, American utilities, American consumers choosing Canadian energy because it's reliable, it's close, and most importantly, it's exactly what their infrastructure was designed to use. So when Trump says we don't need Canada, what he's actually saying is we don't need 63% of our crude oil imports. We don't need 98% of our natural gas. We don't need 82% of our electricity, which is another way of saying we don't need functioning refineries. We don't need heated homes in winter. We don't need stable power grids. But energy is just the beginning. Canada was the top destination for U.S. goods exports in 2024. Not second, not top 5, the largest. American businesses exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada last year. Meanwhile, the U.S. imported $413 billion from Canada. Now, Trump loves talking about that trade deficit. He treats it as proof America is being taken advantage of. But here's what that analysis completely misses. About 50% of U.S.-Canada trade isn't finished products being sold across borders. It's components, raw materials, intermediate goods crossing back and forth as part of integrated supply chains. When a Chevy Silverado rolls off an assembly line in Michigan, components in that truck have crossed the border multiple times during production. Steel from Ontario, shipped to Ohio to be formed into parts, back to Canada for processing, then returned to the U.S. for final assembly. That's not exploitation. That's two economies so deeply intertwined, it's genuinely difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. And here's what Trump fundamentally misunderstands. Yes, Canada depends heavily on the American market, but American businesses, American workers, American consumers are equally dependent on that trade flowing smoothly. When you impose 25% tariffs on your largest trading partner, you're not punishing them in isolation. You're disrupting your own supply chains, raising costs for your own businesses, sending the bill to your own consumers, and we're watching that play out in real time. The question isn't whether Canada needs America. The question is, what happens when America convinces itself it doesn't need Canada? Because the math doesn't lie, and what the math is showing right now should terrify you. The tariffs Trump imposed in early 2025 hit Canada like an economic earthquake. By April, Canadian exports to the United States had plunged 26% from their January peak. That's not a trade adjustment. That's a collapse. Manufacturing output contracted. Export-dependent provinces like Ontario and Alberta saw businesses laying off workers, canceling expansion plans, desperately searching for alternative markets that don't exist at the scale they need. But here's what American media hasn't been covering nearly enough. Those tariffs didn't just hurt Canada. U.S. imports overall fell 20% in April 2025, the largest single-month decline since the 2009 financial crisis, excluding the pandemic. Why? Because when you slap tariffs on half your imports, businesses can't instantly find domestic replacements. Supply chains don't reconfigure in weeks. Production capacity doesn't materialize because a president signs an executive order. American manufacturers suddenly paying 25% more for Canadian steel didn't celebrate. They absorbed the cost, crushed their profit margins, and quietly started planning layoffs. American consumers didn't notice immediately, but they will. Inflation, which had finally been cooling, is ticking back up. The Federal Reserve is watching nervously. Economists across the political spectrum are using words like self-inflicted wound and unforced error, and the consequences go far beyond economics. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian Prime Minister said, "Canadians now live in dark days brought on by a country we can no longer trust." That country is the United States. Not Russia, not China, the United States of America. That's not political posturing. That's a fundamental rupture in a relationship that has been the bedrock of North American security for generations. Trump hasn't just threatened tariffs. He's openly, repeatedly called for Canada to be annexed as the 51st state. He's suggested using economic force to make it happen. He's mocked Canadian leaders. He's questioned Canada's sovereignty. He's treated the entire country as if it's a property to be acquired in one of his real estate deals. The reaction in Canada has been unprecedented. According to 2025 polling, 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. In a country where people rarely agree on anything, you've got near universal consensus. Another poll found 82% of Canadians would rather become a dominion of the British Empire again than be annexed by the United States. Think about that. Canadians who spent decades building their own identity separate from Britain would rather go back to the Commonwealth than join the U.S. under these circumstances. Canadian nationalism has surged. There's been a massive spike in Buy Canadian campaigns. Consumers are actively avoiding American products. Canadian automobile trips to the United States are down 31% year over year, not because of gas prices, because Canadians are choosing not to spend money in a country whose president treats them with open contempt. And it's not just symbolic. Canada has imposed retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, with another $125 billion targeted if the trade war escalates. Canadian provinces have threatened to cut off energy exports to certain U.S. states. Ontario floated the idea of cutting electricity to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. They backed off, but the fact it was even discussed shows how far this relationship has deteriorated. Meanwhile, Trump's annexation rhetoric has taken on a darker edge. He said repeatedly that Canada lives because of the United States. He suggested Canadians would be better off as Americans. He's called Canadian leaders governors instead of prime ministers. This isn't diplomacy. This is a fundamental denial of Canada's sovereignty and legitimacy as an independent nation. And here's what's genuinely alarming. International observers are drawing comparisons they've never drawn before. Trump's statements about Canada are being compared to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine before the invasion, Xi Jinping's language about Taiwan, the idea that a neighboring country isn't really independent, that its sovereignty is conditional, that absorption is inevitable and even desirable. These comparisons might seem hyperbolic, but they're coming from serious foreign policy analysts, not partisan commentators. NATO allies are watching with growing alarm. if the United States is willing to economically coerce Canada, its longest-standing ally, what does that say about American commitments to Estonia, Poland, any smaller nation that depends on U.S. security guarantees? The entire rules-based international order that America spent 70 years building is predicated on one idea: treaties matter, alliances are more than transactions, sovereignty is inviolable regardless of relative power. When Trump suggests using economic force to acquire Greenland, when he floats military options for the Panama Canal, when he talks about annexing Canada, he's not just making controversial statements. He's systematically dismantling the perception that the United States can be trusted to uphold the norms it claims to champion. And once that perception is gone, it doesn't come back quickly, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office next. So let's test the claims seriously. Let's run the thought experiment. What actually happens if America doesn't need Canada? Imagine Canada stopped exporting energy to the United States tomorrow. Not likely, not politically feasible. But as a thought experiment, follow the logic. Refineries along the Gulf Coast would scramble to find 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude from somewhere. Venezuelan production is at historic lows. Mexican output is declining. Middle Eastern suppliers would need months, maybe years, to reconfigure shipping routes and refinery processes. In the meantime, gasoline prices spike. Heating costs soar. The political consequences would be immediate and severe. Now imagine Canada stopped exporting natural gas. Homes in the Midwest freezing in winter. Power plants in the Northeast scrambling for alternative fuel sources. Rolling blackouts becoming not just possible, but probable. The economic damage would be measured not in billions, but potentially trillions, as manufacturing slows, businesses shut down, entire regions struggle to function. These aren't hypothetical doomsday scenarios I'm inventing to make a point. These are the practical realities of what "we don't need Canada" actually means when you follow the logic to its conclusion. The United States has built its economy over decades on the assumption of Canadian reliability. That oil flows north to south. That natural gas moves through pipelines without disruption. That electricity crosses the border to keep the lights on. "We don't rely on Canada" isn't just wrong. It's so completely divorced from economic reality that it calls into question whether the person saying it understands how modern economies function at all. But here's the deeper question nobody's asking. What happens when you convince yourself you don't need something you actually depend on? History is full of examples, and they're never pretty. The Soviet Union convinced itself it didn't need market mechanisms. The result was decades of stagnation and eventual collapse. Britain convinced itself Brexit would be economically painless because other countries needed them more than they needed Europe. The result has been years of economic underperformance. America is now running the same experiment in real time. Can you maintain the world's largest economy while systematically alienating your closest trading partners? Can you impose tariffs on half your imports without triggering inflation, job losses, and economic contraction? The early results are not encouraging. Canada's economy contracted in the second quarter of 2025, the direct result of U.S. tariffs. But the U.S. economy is also slowing. The Commerce Department reported economic contraction in early 2025. Consumer confidence is falling. Business investment is declining. And this is before we even get to the 2026 USMCA review. That's the trade deal that replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term. It's up for review next year, and the Trump administration has made clear it's willing to walk away if it doesn't get the concessions it wants. If that happens, economists are predicting a full-scale recession in Canada and significant economic damage in the United States. Here's what that would look like. Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.6%, roughly $78 billion Canadian. That's depression-level contraction. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy would shrink by 1.6%, about $467 billion. Americans would effectively be paying $1,300 per person per year for the privilege of economically punishing Canada. And for what? Trump claims the tariffs are about border security, about stopping fentanyl and undocumented migrants. But the data shows overwhelmingly those problems originate elsewhere. Canada isn't the source of America's fentanyl crisis. Illegal border crossings from Canada are minimal compared to the southern border. So if the stated justifications don't hold up, what's really driving this? Some analysts believe it's purely transactional. Others think it's performative. Still others worry it's something darker, a genuine belief that American power should be used to dominate rather than build alliances. Whatever the motivation, the consequences are real, measurable, and accelerating. Canadian businesses are diversifying away from the U.S. market as fast as they can. Trade with Europe is growing. Relationships with Asian markets are deepening. Every Canadian business that finds a non-American buyer, every supply chain reconfigured to avoid U.S. tariffs, every investment that flows elsewhere, that's economic capacity that won't easily come back. Even if a future administration tries to repair the relationship, and it's not just Canada. Mexico is watching, Europe is watching, Japan, South Korea, Australia. Every American ally is doing the same calculation. If the U.S. is willing to treat Canada this way, what happens to us if we fall out of favor? The answer increasingly is none. No guarantees, no certainty. And so they're hedging, diversifying, quietly preparing for a world where the United States is less central, less reliable, less essential than it's been since World War II. That's the real cost of we don't need Canada, not the trade deficit, not even the immediate economic damage. It's the long-term erosion of American influence, the slow but irreversible process of allies deciding they can't depend on the United States anymore. Because here's the thing about trust. It takes decades to build and moments to shatter. You can't tweet your way back into being a reliable partner. You can't bluff your way into the kind of deep economic integration that made North America one of the most prosperous regions on Earth. So where does this end? Maybe Trump backs down. Maybe Canada and the U.S. stumble into a crisis that forces de-escalation. Maybe the 2026 review becomes a reset rather than a breaking point. But here's what I do know. Every day this continues. Every time Trump repeats the fantasy that America doesn't need Canada, the economic damage compounds. Supply chains that took decades to build get dismantled in months. Relationships that weathered wars and recessions crumble over trade disputes that shouldn't exist. And when historians look back at this moment, when they try to understand how one of the most successful alliances in modern history deteriorated so quickly, they're going to point to one sentence. We don't rely on Canada. 3 words that encapsulate everything wrong with treating international relations like a real estate negotiation, with confusing dependence for weakness, with believing raw power can replace partnership. America might not think it needs Canada, but mathematics, unlike politics, doesn't care what you believe. The 4 million barrels of oil per day, the 98% of natural gas imports, the 82% of electricity, the $350 billion in exports. These numbers don't change because a president declares them irrelevant. They're the foundation of how the U.S. economy actually functions, as opposed to how some people wish it functioned. And reality, sooner or later, always wins.